Grand Theft Auto III is one of the most critically acclaimed and influential video games of all time. It wasn't the first open-world action game out there, but it was definitely one of the first to grab the world the way something like Body Harvest or even its own predecessors wished they could. However, anyone who's used the internet at all in the last 5 or even 10 years will more than likely be aware of all of GTA 3's shortcomings that have been exposed by time. All of these complaints are completely valid. I'm not going to argue against that. I'm simply here to say that in my opinion, when a sum of a game's parts comes together just right, even a few shoddy mechanics aren't enough to take away from the overall package. A couple of, okay, maybe many signs of age don't necessarily render everything a game does as unplayable, and there are still a handful of things left that GTA 3 did and continues to do with relative ease. First, and arguably most important of all, the driving model is greatly enjoyable. It doesn't have the weight of GTA 4 or the arcade grippiness of 5, but it lies somewhere in the middle, where maneuvering around the map takes just a bit of finesse while still letting you get away with, playing a Grand Theft Auto title. Considering how prevalent the auto part of the series' namesake is in this game, I'd say the driving being as engaging as it is has definitely not hurt the experience over time. While I'll be going over the actual combat a bit later, something that often goes overlooked when discussing the GTA series as a whole is the gun feel. The sound and visual design on Claude's firearms makes even the starting pistol feel snappy and satisfying to shoot. And don't tell me that there's anything better than a point-blank shotgun blast in this game. Getting headshots with the sniper rifle never gets old, and the rocket launcher alone has kept me entertained for longer than some entire video games have. Speaking of entertaining, we take for granted how Rockstar has refined the art of escalation. While rampaging around the city isn't quite as fun as it used to be, mainly because nowadays I always feel like I need to be making some sort of active progress in the game to have fun, I still can't overlook how arcade-like yet forward-thinking the Wanted system truly was. It technically made its debut in the first entry, where it served to add some challenge to reaching the target score, but now it exists almost like its own separate optional challenge that represents the essence of what these games are to a lot of people, both before and after completing the main missions. And finally, when it comes to the missions, I like how they've kept the pseudo non-linear structure from the top-down games, and that you get to choose which of the available missions to tackle first. That doesn't really apply to me since I'm OCD as fuck and just stick to one mission route to completion, but that freedom is still welcome. As I've grown more familiar with games across a much wider portion of the medium's history, I've come to realize that sometimes certain flaws in a game shouldn't just be chalked up to age. Some titles, regardless of when they were made, just have problems that other contemporaries don't have. For example, I used to think that all first-person shooters prior to the 6th generation were just inherently confusing and maze-like. But then I played Quake and realized, hey, a pre-Half-Life FPS is capable of being relatively straightforward in its map design. Another example would be Heretic. Sure, it's no corridor shooter, but during my recent playthrough of that game, I only needed to look up the solution to a single puzzle. Even Unreal is easier to navigate than I remember. Point is, just because a particular set of design cliches and resulting annoyances were common during that time, it doesn't mean that they were due to some greater power telling all game designers to make their game like that. Grand Theft Auto 3 is a textbook example of such a thing. The first and most glaring issue it has that cannot be excused by its release date is the lack of a map. Driver, which came out 2 years and a whole console generation prior, had a map and a semi-reliable waypoint system. There's also the on-foot combat, which, while visually and audibly rewarding, is mechanically stiff and was bested by something like Rune, or if we're talking about ranged combat, Rayman 2. Seriously, DMA could have literally copied that game's strafing and lock-on system and no one would have complained. The problem isn't the fact that it's clunky, but the fact that it's not functional. When you can't strafe, you can't dodge, although that wouldn't really help much since most weapons are hit scan anyway. The lack of a checkpoint system is a bit of a weird one since, let's be honest, no one actually plays the 3D era GTA games without abusing at least the health cheat. Although, that's not to say that dying is the only failure state. Plenty of missions require certain NPCs to be alive or cars to be kept running, so you're still gonna fail at least a few times. I can cut the developers a little more slack here, since I really can't think of many open world games prior to GTA 3 to use any sort of checkpoint system. Although, games don't exist in isolation, and plenty of titles of other genres already had perfectly functioning auto checkpoint systems in play, even on consoles. An example that came out a full year and, again, console generation prior would be something like Turok 3. I get that it's a different kind of game, but GTA's missions are ultimately linear tasks with a clear starting point, a couple of intermediate points, and an end, so DMA could have easily just assigned one or more of those intermediate points as checkpoints. Such a system would have come especially in handy later on in the game when the rival gang system becomes more prominent. Just like GTA 2, over the course of the story, certain gangs will grow hostile towards the player and will attack on sight. This obviously makes certain story missions and pretty much all the optional missions like Taxi, Vigilante, and Paramedic far more challenging than the mission designers probably intended. What's particularly baffling is that the aforementioned GTA 2 already had a reasonable solution to this. Each gang could have its relationship with the player altered at any time, so if you were doing a mission that involved driving, say, through loony territory, you could just improve your stance with them beforehand. Sure, said mission could ultimately send you back to square one, but at least you won't have to worry about gang attacks during the mission itself. I'm not necessarily saying that GTA 3 should have kept this system, since it would have added a little too much to think about on top of the novelty of the open world, but tying the gang's aggression level to arbitrary points in the story was not the way to go. Clearly, this game has some problems, only a few of which are actually due to its age, with the rest of them just being jarring oversights. But you know what? When you sit down and actually play GTA 3, none of those things matter anymore. Before I elaborate, I want to make it clear that I have no nostalgia for this title. Sure, I played Vice City and San Andreas many years before I should have been allowed to, but I remained completely oblivious to GTA 3's existence until, fittingly enough, I was quote-unquote old enough to play it. Anyway, why should we excuse such glaring design flaws when they could have been avoided had the developers taken hints from years past? Well, it's pretty simple in fact. You've probably heard this before. Grand Theft Auto 3 is the kind of game where the gameplay almost takes a back seat compared to what is truly the main event. Liberty City itself, and the experience of simply being in this world. Big deal, right? I mean, every Rockstar game does that too. These guys are unmatched in creating a believable yet over-the-top world that is both hostile yet inviting to explore. Well, with GTA 3, there's something that clicks with me when it comes to the art direction and soundscape. Don't get me wrong, Vice City has that 80s flair, and San Andreas is a sun-kissed playground, but 2001's interpretation of Liberty City appeals to me on a level that even GTA 4's objectively more detailed and realized depiction of the place doesn't compare to. Something about the building proportions in relation to the vehicles, the road and sidewalk textures, the specific designs of the cars and pedestrians. I don't know, man, it's just intoxicating to observe. The radio stations are a huge part of it, not just the cynical and parody-like hosts and presenters, but I'm actually talking about the music itself. Not enough people seem to talk about how some of the stations, most notably Head Radio and Lips, play music that was written specifically for GTA 3 rather than it being licensed. I think that helps to create this clear divide between those two stations and, say, Flashback, which plays cuts off the 1983 Scarface soundtrack. Just using these free stations as examples, you can see that contrast DMA were probably aiming to create between that toothless, contemporary for the time pop rock sound and the kind of music that people of a certain generation put on a pedestal, despite the fact that most 80s pop was written and produced in much the same way, just with less Pro Tools and Melodyne. Keep in mind, I'm not usually one for immersion. Generally, I like my games to be utilitarian in their gameplay and presentation. As long as I can see what I'm doing and I know what I'm doing, then I'm satisfied. And even if you stripped GTA 3 of all of the things that give it that distinct presence, I'm still hard-pressed to say that it would fail to hold my attention. Obviously, it wouldn't linger in memory for as long as it does, without that look and feel, but there's an oddly addictive and replayable character to the simplicity of the overarching structure. Honestly, sometimes I'll just create a save file just to play through the opening few missions again with no intention of getting to the end. In fact, I've still never beaten this game, only making it as far as the final third of the story. it just has this first few levels of a platformer sort of thing going on, you know? Like, even if you're not here for the long haul, you still find those opening minutes endearing enough that you want to turn that into a routine. Maybe I'm just weird, but I do that with a lot of games, especially the kind that generally aren't meant to be played in this compartmentalized sort of way. While the backbone of a great video game has always been and will always be the gameplay, I feel that by the late 90s and 2000s, the medium had made enough strides in the rest of the parts that create the whole, narrative, visuals, and sound, that leaning on the gameplay was no longer a complete necessity. Of course, that doesn't mean we should excuse the kind of games where the gameplay is completely shafted in favor of a self-indulgent story or an excuse to give Nvidia more of your money. But there is definitely a fine line to walk between a Space Invaders and a Dear Esther. Ultimately, all video games, or at least all games that strive to appeal to more than just a specific niche, are no more complicated than an 80s arcade title at their core, regardless of how many superfluous systems get piled on top. Grand Theft Auto Free, for example, might as well be Pac-Man, but with gang members instead of ghosts and RPGs instead of power pellets. What separates it from games before and since is its unique depiction of a ubiquitous environment, a crime-ridden metropolis. Even if the gameplay has some holes, they are filled out by the context surrounding it and sealed shut by how we feel being a part of it.